Hello, and welcome to another episode of the AgNext Podcast. We're always excited to tell you about what's next from AgNext. We're coming to you today from Colorado State University, and we're excited because we have a guest who's been here before, our director, Dr. Kim Stackhouse-Lawson, and then a new guest, a brand new guest, Anna Shadbolt, who is AgNext Grazing Management Outreach and Research Coordinator. They're joining us on the show today, and we're going to talk about a project they've been working on for the last couple of months, almost a year now, right? Called the Grazing Principles. So let's get into it.
Welcome back to the podcast, Kim. It's a pleasure to have you here. Anna, this is your first time here. So we want to take a second to let you introduce yourself. Tell us about your background and your role here in the AgNext team.
Yes, so I am Anna Shadbolt. I am from two working ranches in the Sandhills of Nebraska, multi-generational ranches, grew up, and cattle, the whole thing, hayfield. From there, I came to Colorado State University, where I got a degree in human dimensions of natural resources, and then worked at the USDA ARS Central Plains Experimental Range for 2 years before coming to AgNext. And here, my role is a research associate, but I work primarily in our grazing systems, but we have a really integrated team, so we touch a little bit of everything, and yeah. A little bit about me.
Awesome. Well, welcome to the podcast. We're glad you're here today. All right. So our first question, we kind of want to we want to talk about this cool project, Grazing Principles. And so I'm curious, Kim, could you talk a little bit about the project and what led to the development of it, and how's it been received?
Yeah, thanks for having me back on and the opportunity to talk about the principles, which has been one of our more popular grazing projects that AgNext has executed and conducted. It was led by Dr. Kevin Jablonski, who's no longer with CSU, but continues to help Anna and myself in this particular project. So the real impetus around the grazing principles was to work to consolidate science and scientific research across the arid West. And so those grazing systems are some of the most complex in the world. And of course, because of the complexity, both from a regionality perspective, but also from a climate perspective and people, the research is dispersed, right? Mm-hmm. So it's very different, and the results can be very different across the landscape. And so one of the things that Kevin really wanted to do was to really work to begin to pull the rangeland ecology and animal performance and human dimension and weather and climate patterns research together, to consolidate that, and then to recommend larger, more strategic principles by which ranchers could work through to do a better job managing the landscape. And so the way he went about that is to pull together an advisory committee of expert scientists in the rangeland ecology grazing space. They put together an initial survey, which was then sent to more than 100 grazing experts. And those grazing experts were producers on the landscapes, scientists, NRCS agents, et cetera. They got that original survey back, and the advisory committee looked through that survey, analyzed the data, came up with the first draft of Grazing Principles, and then took it to the Society for Range Management meeting, where they hosted a campfire session, got additional input back, and then that team developed these grazing management principles. The advisory committee developed those grazing management principles. And that research is published and is on our website as a peer-reviewed publication. And so the real unique thing about this work is that sort of consolidation of very complex science into higher level theories that are more easily communicated and also uniquely allow adaptation in an individual plot. And so you'll hear from Anna. She's doing some incredible work actually in the field right now. But one of the things that's important for the principles is, well, we've built them and they're still theoretical, right? We haven't really tested them. Anna's working on testing those today. But one of the things we really want to test is do these theories translate? Do they translate in an adaptable fashion? Can a landowner, can a rancher, can they use them? Do they want to use them? Do they inspire something different?
Or are they maybe already using them, but they're just not written down, right?
Are they using them? Are they not written down? Yeah. And so one of the things we always hear from people is that this is not new information.
Sure.
But what I think is unique about it is it's novel in its presentation. It's novel in its consolidation. And then I think we're learning it's actually very novel in its adoption. And that's what makes it exciting.
Oh, that's cool. So for our listeners, you can find a copy of the Grazing Principles on our website under resources, I believe. And so I've got a question for Anna, but just to help fill in the gaps here, I'm going to read through what the titles are of each grazing principle, just so we can frame the conversation. So those are practice adaptive management, optimize stocking rate, use a grazing plan, prioritize ecological health, consider distribution, welfare begets performance, and then also think beyond the range. So I just wanted to get those out into this conversation so we can kind of dive in. So, and I've heard you say before in presentations that you like to look at the grazing principles as more of like a menu of options available for producers. Can you talk to us a little bit about what that means and how you engage that way?
Yeah, so it's important to recognize that these aren't hierarchical. So there's not one principle that's more important than the other. And they're not orderly. You don't have to do 1 and then 2 and then 3. So that's kind of where the menu starts, right? Is that you can do this in any order at any time. As we know, ranching is incredibly difficult, right? There's a lot of different variables. Some years you have a drought. Some years you have a lot of precipitation. The markets, there's a million variables that we can't control.
Right.
What we can control is our response to that, especially on our rangelands. And so there's no expectation of a producer to do all 7 of these principles every single year. It's going to vary month to month, week to week, year to year. But the process is what we want to emphasize here, right? Is you want to go through these 7 principles and recognize that you are or aren't doing it and why. And then you also have data at that point, right? You've gone through a process, you've monitored that specific principle and decided against doing it or doing it. So yeah, that's where the menu of options comes into play.
Yeah, that's awesome. Thank you for that clarifier. Go ahead.
I think one of the important points is, and Kim mentioned that, you mentioned, Jerry mentioned, it's a lot of times producers are doing that already. So, and I think the other good thing is that there were producers involved on the creation of the 7 principles, right? So it's not a researcher that's sitting behind his computer and say, oh, I have this great idea, let's implement them. I think one of the beauties of these principles is that it's coming from a group of people who has experience in managing I believe their farms and their operations, and that's really good. So you mentioned that. So like my questions on all of those 7 principles, are there any of those that you've seen that are more common adopted, or in some that have more challenge to be adopted? Do you have any feeling out of those 7 principles that we have here? Definitely.
So welfare begets performance. I've noticed that one is probably the most tangible and easily seen because it's your cattle, it's your product, And so I've been talking to producers that one is like, obviously we're going to do that. We're giving our cattle the most nutrition, the most, the best. So I think that one's probably the most obvious, if you will. And then think beyond the range. Upon reading these, I kind of thought that was going to be the one that was going to be the most nuanced for producers to interact with, but it's actually been really exciting because it's things as simple as talking to my neighbors about my grazing plan. And it doesn't have to be these big, profound, like a podcast or a blog or, going to the school. It can just be these little interactions. And that's important to note too, is that this isn't prescriptive. We're not telling anyone to do it exactly this way. It's supposed to be adaptive. It's supposed to be creative. The guidebook in itself is an adaptive management practice, right? So yeah, those would be like the high and low ends of those. Yeah.
Which is interesting. While I was reading, I was like, think beyond the range, and I was like, what does that mean? Like, and it's a good point. Like, it's talking to a neighbor. Like, the innovation doesn't have to come from somebody who is bringing a new technology or something. It might be something that Kim is doing on her farm that I can adopt to my farm, and it's moving the production and the sustainability of that forward, right?
Absolutely. And just being really intentional about it. We had a field day and we had a workshop with these, and the group that got Think Beyond the Range was actually a bunch of really hardcore range management people. And so it was kind of fitting that they got Think Beyond the Range, and they actually identified talking to policymakers and, like looking at it from a political lens. So yeah, there's a lot of different routes you could take with each one of these.
It's great.
In research that we're doing now, excuse me, Anna is basically working with 3 different ranchers in Colorado to, I don't want to say test, because I don't think it's stronger than we evaluate. Yes, evaluate the principles. And my favorite story is the one of the producer who's a 4th or 5th generation who is working through use a grazing plan. Anna, tell the story, because it's heartwarming.
Yeah. So first off, this producer has been an absolute delight to work with, completely on board really quickly, and just really put a lot of effort and gumption into these principles. But yeah, so his son is the 5th generation in this ranch, and they have never used a written grazing plan, which a lot of producers don't, right? It's not a common thing. But this year was the first year that they actually sat down, his dad, the producer I'm talking to, and his son, and wrote down a grazing plan. And it's been fun to talk to him, because obviously they're having benefits like on the rangelands and ecologically, but also from a social standpoint, they're sitting down as a team and involving their stakeholders, and have a business now with a written plan. So yeah.
They started with family meetings to work towards writing a grazing plan. And yeah, it is cool. And when you think about that, like, what does it mean to have a family meeting? All of a sudden, a grazing plan isn't just an ecological tool. It could be a generational transfer tool. It could be some really remarkable things that are built.
Well, and I think sometimes it can probably give you a chance to think about how you would respond if something was going to happen, so that in the moment, if like all of a sudden, there's a flood or whatever, right, that you're not having to come up with the plan. You're just, okay, where is the plan? I'm going to look at it and see.
Absolutely.
That can be a helpful tool also.
And speaking to multi-generational ranches, and wanting to pass it on to the next generation, if you had a drought in 2012, your son could be like, oh, what did my dad do in 2012 to figure that out?
That's
yeah.
Because like, if you look at the number one that like I have listed here is adaptive management, right? So even though you have the plan, you also have to be adaptive to the other. And to that note, just Kim, I'm gonna say this: like, I was in a field day the other day, and someone saw me with an AgNext shirt, and they came and said, "Oh, do you know Anna? Like, she's working with us."
That's cool.
So I believe it's one of the producers that she's working with. So they are super happy with this evaluation of the principles, I believe. But so like we covered a little bit like adaptive management, like grazing plan. What is like considered distribution? Like what does that mean? Like,
yeah, so consider distribution. That is, so I kind of actually like to talk about consider distribution and optimized stocking rate together, because it's how you're interacting with your livestock on your rangelands. So you're talking about the class of animal, the age, the breed, if you're going to be bringing in yearlings, that type of thing. But then the consider distribution piece is how are you putting those animals on your livestock, on your rangeland. So moving fence lines, using virtual fence. If you can move your water, that's a huge privilege for some people, but moving your water sources, moving your salt blocks, things like that, and really engaging with your landscape and your cattle together, making sure you're doing the best everywhere.
That's pretty cool. And that comes back to the point that you said there's not the most important one is basically they can work together. Sometimes one will work for your operation, sometimes the other won't. That's one of the beauties of the principles, right?
Exactly.
So this resource, so you mentioned there was a guidebook, and then there's also, the guidebook, and then is there a published paper that supports this too? All that stuff's on our website. So at AgNext, we do like to provide a lot of resources to folks. And so, Kim, I'm wondering, how do you think that this project connects to the kind of broader land grant mission here at CSU and engaging with producers and co-developing some stuff? We'd just love to hear from you on your perspective on that.
Yeah, so I think this kind of work is absolutely the essence of the land grant mission. You know, the way that the science was pulled together through an advisory committee of some of the best rangeland scientists in the country. But even though they could have written those, they could have written principles themselves.
Sure.
They didn't, right? They embodied that land grant co-development mission from the very beginning of, you know, going out and saying, hey, we're going to survey people first. We're going to take the surveys. We're going to combine the science. We're going to develop a set of principles for folks to react to. That's the published paper. That's this guidebook. And we're not done, right? This is really where the work begins is, okay, we're going to go out and evaluate these things. We're going to make sure these are the right 7. We're going to make sure they're applicable to real people on the landscape. We're going to make sure they're not prescriptive, right? Because I think one of the things that Anna has learned just in the few ranchers she's engaged with is one of the reasons this works is we're not telling somebody how to write a grazing plan. We're just encouraging them to write the grazing plan and then providing consolidated information about what they might consider, right? So it is taking years and years and years of published papers, scientific papers, and putting it in a 1-page form, right? And that's what we're here to do, right? That is the land grant mission. That is taking incredible science to the landscape and at the same time learning from the landscape, producers, animals, and the range itself, and embodying that back and improving our process and improving our science. And so this project in particular is just such a wonderful example of what we do.
That's awesome. Yeah.
I agree. That's a lot of times we can come with a recipe to producers and say, hey, that's what you should do. This. But like, I think starting from let's make the plan and let's see what works, what doesn't. And I think you're in that process now. Is that correct? Like, so you're working with producers. How is that being received by the producers? And what are your expectations? What are you planning to do with that information that you're getting from the producers on those meetings? Yeah.
So it's a moving target, right? As we collect this data, this information, we're building the story. Something I'm finding really interesting is that we're identifying different groups of people and how they interact with the information we're giving them. We have multi-generational families. We have first-generation families. We have, people that have a PhD in engineering that decided to get into ranching, which is really, it's a pretty diverse group of people, these 3 people. So we're wanting to, one, take what we learned from these 3 producers, and we actually are going to be doing more interviews next year. So we'll be expanding our landscape going throughout Colorado, but also testing to see, does this work in other landscapes too? Does this work in Louisiana or the Sandhills in Nebraska? And really expanding this outside of just Colorado or just the Western United States.
How did you get to those 3 producers? And what are, like you mentioned, the unique characteristics of the person, but like, how can you just tell us about the operations and how did you come up to them? Yeah,
so we work really closely with CCA, Colorado Cattlemen's Association, on this project. They actually put a call out to all their members, and we had, I think, 11 members respond back just with interest in working on the project. From those 11 members, we did narrow it down to 3, these 3, as kind of the pilot year, if you will. So we worked with Colorado Cattlemen's to identify these producers, and it's worked really, really well, that mutual engagement, so we're not just cold calling people or calling on random people. It's their interest as well.
Oh, that's great. That's awesome.
Another good example of the land grant mission work, right? Really engaging at the level of our producer associations.
Yes.
To speak kind of to the prescriptive part of it, the first interview I had with them, just the kind of introductory, this is who I am, this is what we're doing. They all were under the assumption that I was going to go in and be like, you're doing this, this, and this, you need to be doing these things, and like really come in and kind of, and when they're like, oh, you just want us to engage with these principles and talk to you about them? I'm like, that's pretty much it.
That's what that's what we're trying to do.
Yeah. And get you to, interact with this. They all were like over the moon about that and really jumped fully into the guidebook.
What is the thing that you think that made them jump in? Is the Kim mentioned a couple of times, I would like the complexity of bringing these things together and probably make it simple. Is that the beauty of those 7 principles? Is that something like...
I think this is one of the questions that we'll look into as well is, what is making these people adopt these things or not adopt them for that matter?
And what's making them want to change? So Anna surveys pre and post every one of her interviews, engagement opportunities. And she can track the change in behavior or the change in interaction, right? Behavior might be a little...
Or even knowledge too,
sure,
right? Just whatever it is, yeah.
Yes, exactly. And one of our questions is, what is it, right? What is inspiring this movement? Is it the engagement with a person, with Anna?
Is it charisma, actually?
It could be.
She's delightful. Is it the non-prescriptive nature? Is it? We don't know, and we might not know after this first pilot.
Yeah.
It may take a little longer.
I think there's something to say, though, for a university to approach folks and say, hey, we would just love to talk to you about something, instead of coming like hey, we know what you should be doing. And I think even that can open doors for conversations and even just being able to listen. And I know, Anna, at the field day you were talking about, you presented on these, and that group of folks, I think it was the range folks, they had mentioned, like, I never think to ask my neighbors about these things. Like, I see my neighbors and I talk to them about whatever, right? Whatever's happening, maybe the weather, whatever, but they never say, hey, do you have a management plan, or are you going to move your cattle later, sooner, or whatever? And they're like, I could be asking my community members about this too, which I thought was just an interesting interaction that had come up too.
Yeah.
So on that note, like, what is next, right? On the grazing principle that you mentioned about those 3 producers, what are the next steps? Like, what are you, or are we planning like to accomplish with that? I'm not going to put that on your shoulder, but
so we have, in partnership with Colorado Cattlemen's, 2 more grants to continue to do this work. So this work has, I don't think the Grazing Principles have ever lost a grant when we've put it in. So it is being really well received by the kind of grazing funding community. So the next step is to do exactly what Anna is doing now with the pilot 3 with, is it 12 more? I think it might be 12 more ranchers.
Yeah. Oh, cool.
Across Colorado. So it will be the same approach. We'll work through CCA. There'll be a larger membership call. We're going to be working out at ECRC, so the Eastern Colorado Research Center, which is a CSU center. We're going to be using the CSU cows out there, applying the principles, engaging the principles at ECRC, and then evaluating lesser prairie chicken habitat and populations. So starting to really layer some of these, wildlife interactions, and then how the principles engage with some of these targeted species.
Yeah.
So, it sounds like you've engaged a lot of different producer organizations and a lot of individual producers. And so I'm curious, how do you see these principles maybe being used by other organizations for informing their grazing management programs, or do you ever see it becoming a little more formalized? I mean, it's formalized now, right? It's peer-reviewed, published, but any other kind of formalization on that?
So to start with the formalization question, this is the first iteration.
Sure.
And there's probably going to be feedback. We're probably going to change it. That's the point of it, is it for it to be a fluid thing, an adaptive management program, even as, the climate changes, as the landscapes change, as just the world in general changes, maybe these will change. So the formalized might be formalized again. It might be changing. And then as far as other agencies using this, I think there's absolutely potential, whether it's, very high level government, if it's smaller community agencies, using it as an entire framework, just as is, or just using it as, bits and pieces as a general idea. Kim, do you have anything to add to that?
Yeah, I think there's opportunity in the corporate space, right? So we know that we've got larger food companies with big sustainability commitments. And, these touch all three sustainability pillars: environmental, social, and economic. One of the things that we want to add, and will be probably the next grant that we write for these principles, using the data we've collected from the ranchers we will be engaging with, is how do we really measure outcomes from each of the principles, right? So what are the measurable science-based metrics, progress? How do we do that, right? Because we're theorizing now.
It's beautiful, the principle.
It's beautiful. The theory is beautiful, but there's a lot of nuance in the measure, right?
Oh, sure.
And so we need to work through that. And then the other thing we want to add is an economic component. And so I think we might be able to layer some of that with this next 12, right? So John Ritten on our team has done very well in the ranching community, really even building trust to get profit and loss statements. And so we can really begin to compile some data around that. But I think those things will be really helpful if we can start to facilitate some more like measurable things. I think adoption of these principles could become wider. And what I mean by wider is sort of outside of the producer community. And that's maybe one thing we didn't know would happen. There's been interest from that now as sort of, like, oh, this could be applied at larger than just on the landscape. And our intent was just to help producers, right?
Oh,
so
sure.
now we're trying to figure out, okay, what do we need to add to make it more inclusive of the entire value chain without losing the applicability to ranchers?
Sure.
One of the questions that I have here is like, if I'm a producer in the eastern, let's say Missouri, can I apply the principles? Like, is that like we're talking about Western?
Good question.
If JR's brother, it's Missouri, right, JR?
Yeah.
If he's
Shout out
listening,
to JT if he's listening.
if he's listening to us, like, do you think that he could go to the principles, or your family in Nebraska? Like, we talked about the publication is focused on the Western of the United States. Could that be? I think they're simple enough that can be applied, but what are your feelings on that?
I agree with you, Pedro. They're broad enough and they're adaptive enough to the individual that I think you could take them and put them anywhere, really. But that's something that we don't know. These are created from the Western United States. So that's further research. It would definitely have a potential there to go into those areas and say, like, is, a drought management plan pertinent in Missouri? Maybe not. Maybe we tweak it. Maybe we shift things a little bit there. So maybe there's, multiple iterations, like I was saying, for different areas, for different types of agencies. Maybe there's, a corporate version of this and then a producer version. There's a lot of potential routes to take this. But as is, I think that someone in Missouri could probably look at this and benefit their rangelands. There's nothing that's going to be detrimental or anything like that.
I agree.
Cool.
Yeah. So, Kim, you had just mentioned this before around the pillars of sustainability. And so I'm curious, how does this particular research and this particular project connect to sustainability and the broader work that we do here at AgNext?
Yeah. So the ranching community is so foundational, right, to our work across so much of what we do. And so I think we could pick any topic. We could pick animal health. We could pick greenhouse gases. We could, any of our topics and link it back to healthy cattle, healthy rangelands, and healthy communities that are really supporting animal agriculture. And this is the kind of work that AgNext is here to do, right? This is the kind of sustainability work that our team loves. It's the kind of work that brings producers and scientists and hopefully others, right, to the table to say, this is what animal agriculture could look reimagined. And that doesn't mean that it was bad before, right?
Oh, sure.
I mean, there's so much good science here and there's so much good insight here from producers. Sometimes it's just packaging it differently, right? Sometimes it's just doing a better job communicating that science. And so I think it's just foundational to our work.
That's awesome. Well, thanks for being on the podcast. I'm curious, is there anything that we didn't get to today that you would want to add about the Grazing Principles.
Go check them out.
Oh, go check them out. I love that. So anybody that's interested, you can find those on our website under resources. We've got the guidebook, a link to the published research, and then also kind of a one-pager snapshot version of it as well. But thank you both for joining us today, and thank you all for joining us as well on the AgNext podcast. We would love to have you join the conversation, as always, so feel free to follow us on LinkedIn, Twitter, or Facebook, and we'll hopefully you'll tune in next time to the AgNext podcast. We're always excited to tell you about what's next from AgNext.